Well, as Washington struggles to make a deal to keep the government open overseas, the Trump administration is working against another tight deadline, with another round of U.S.-China trade talks kicking off this week in Beijing, amid rising fears that the world's two largest economies will fail to make a deal by March 1st, at which point the U.S. has threatened to crank up tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods, which could trigger the same back from China. Much is vested in the relationship with that Asian powerhouse, but for my next guest, Parab Khanna, China is a distraction. Author of The Future is Asian, Khanna argues that the West must view Asia and not just China as a powerful economic force. And he's joining me now from New York. Welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Christian.
So let's just take the first nitty-gritty and then we'll go into the bigger picture. How much do you see is at stake and possible to resolve this now trade showdown between the United States and China and yet another round of tariffs and, you know, as you just heard Senator Toomey say, it's a tax on the American people?
That's exactly right. So on the one hand, there's evidence that both sides might be feeling a little bit of pain. We see declining consumer confidence in China, for example. That may be more cyclical, however, than structural. Meanwhile, the senator is absolutely correct that industry after industry in the United States, by which I mean soybean farmers, other food exporters, steel, where the rising costs of imports are being passed on to consumers, the tech sector with declining revenues in China, across the American economy, when it comes to those sectors that do depend to some degree, large or small, on exports to foreign markets, particularly to rising Asian powers like China, they are suffering indeed. So there is an incentive on both sides to come to some kind of a compromise, face-saving gestures before the end of the month, and I think that that's certainly on track to happen. But the bigger picture is certainly one where China will continue to try to displace foreign technology, foreign imports in its value chain, and aggressively continue to export with its national champions to conquer foreign markets as well.
Let's just stay quickly on this one for a second. I want to play you what Treasury Secretary Mnuchin has said about the process of these talks.
Right now, the intent is that we meet this deadline. As you know, the president is involved in a very detailed way in these negotiations. Ambassador Lighthizer, myself, and the economic team update the president at least weekly, in many cases daily. He's involved in these issues. And if there are remaining issues that we can't get closed, I think President Trump expects that he's going to sit down with President Xi and address those issues.
So, you know, that's an interesting statement to end on, that if the you know, sort of worker bees can't get it done, then President Trump continues to believe in the sort of face-to-face or voice-to-voice between the top leadership, people who can actually get something done. What chances of that do you think?
I think it would be unfair to the worker bees to say that, you know, they can't resolve all the issues. The fact is that, you know, they are working on all of the issues and that each issue has a different timeline. And that's really what's going on here. Can we accept that they will reopen their markets or they will reduce the reciprocal tariffs on some American exports, which they've already said they're going to do and are doing? And was that enough to forestall Trump's raising tariffs on the final batch of $200 billion worth of Chinese exports? And I think that they are probably going to get there. At the top level, it is obviously worrying, disturbing to many people in diplomacy and observe negotiations, trade or otherwise, that the president would allow himself to simply take the word of a foreign leader rather than allow things to be more legally or, you know, circumscribed in formal agreements, because, of course, he's going to believe, President Xi, that they're making all efforts to reform their economy, to open. He's going to send there are other sort of arrows in the quiver that China has. It has a major effort this year around capital account liberalization, opening its debt, equity, and bond markets to foreigners. It wants that to go very well. It's going to promise that American investors are going to have very, you know, sort of enhanced access to those. And remember that finance is trillions of dollars for China. When we're talking about trade, we're talking about billions. So let's be clear that there's a much broader set of issues on the table here, and they will work through them incrementally, I'm quite sure.
So let's go broader on the bigger picture, not just these trade issues, but basically the substance of your book. And I'm really fascinated by one of these things you say. You point out that in terms of trade, China's priorities are number one, regional partners, number two, Europe, and number three, America. That's kind of amazing because we do hear President Trump and the administration saying, oh, China's going to have to do X, Y, and Z, whether it's trade, whether it's North Korea, because they value the relationship with the U.S. so much.
I'm very glad you brought this up, Christian, because there's a difference between the two largest economies in the world and the two largest trading powers in the world. The two largest trading powers in the world are those that represent the largest proportion of global trade, and America does rank third in that area because actually North America in general, and America in particular, have the most self-sufficiency, autarky, you might say, whereas Europe and Asian powers, including China, are very dependent on trade. So in fact, as you rightly quoted, China's largest trading partners as a bloc are its neighbors. If you add up China's trade with Japan, with South Korea, with the ASEAN countries of Southeast Asia, with India, with Russia, and so forth, it far exceeds China's trade with the United States. And its second most important is the European Union as a whole, which still actually represents a larger share of global trade than China does. And so what you actually have happening right now is a process where in the longer term, no matter what happens in these ongoing bilateral trade negotiations, there's many players in this trade war, and we're ignoring the other ones. What's happening right now is that China is seeking to substitute its dependence on whatever imports it does get from the United States with its neighbors. So if it's not going to buy as much oil and gas from America, it shall get it from Russia. Semiconductors, high-tech processors and components. Why subject yourself to the political manipulation, even if it's justified, of the Trump administration's export controls if you're China, when you can get those same components from Japan, from South Korea, from Taiwan, which are very high-tech economies? And this is what I call in the book permanent substitution. What China in the short term is going to try to do is to have a compromise that doesn't disrupt its supply chains for the goods it gets from the United States. In the long run, it obviously wants to permanently substitute any dependence it has on the U.S. And of course, Japanese, South Koreans, and Europeans are all too eager to displace American technology and exporters in that market.
Okay, so let's, this is really interesting because you say that, much of when people talk about Asia, they automatically just think about China because it's the huge, big powerhouse. But you say Asia is much, much bigger and spans a huge and potentially sort of, unexpected century. You say the Asian century is even bigger than you think, far greater than just China. The new Asian system taking shape is a multi-civilizational order spanning Saudi Arabia to Japan and Russia to Australia, linking 5 billion people through trade, finance, and infrastructure networks that together represent 40% of global GDP. So it kind of falls into what you're saying about priorities and size of markets. Is the U.S. missing out when you put it in these stark terms?
Yes and no. It's missing out in the sense that by not joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, for example, the U.S. is giving itself a disadvantageous sort of position with respect to fast-growing Asian markets. As the senator previously would also have pointed out, Canada and Mexico proportionately have almost the same deficit to China as a share of their total trade as the United States does. But their response is not to launch tariffs against China. It's to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement so they can have better access to Asian markets. And hopefully they're also trying to have bilateral trade liberalization with China. So the response has to be to want to compete more, to engage more. The other reason why it's not too late is, as I point out, the fast-growing markets of the rest of Asia, if you just take South Asia and Southeast Asia, from Pakistan through India, through Myanmar, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, and so forth, that, Christian, is 2.5 billion people. That is 1 billion more people than China, and some of those economies, like India, already have a faster growth rate than China does. And if they grow at just 5%, they will equal China's present GDP size in less than 10 years. So have we been overly fixated on China because it is one single market? Yes. Is it time, and is it not too late, to go after not just China, but all of these other fast-growing, rapidly urbanizing, and young populations? Yes, also yes.
You just mentioned the TPP, and obviously President Trump pulled the U.S. out of it. There's a whole new one that's been underway, the CPTPP. But also there's another one in the works right now. Another big Asia-Pacific trade deal is called RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnerships. That is a lot of initials. However, what does it actually mean if the Trump administration, doesn't partake in the whole protectionism, America first, is continued to be its trade policy?
The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is one of the acronyms that embodies the idea that I talk about in the book, which is Asia First. We are obsessed with this idea of America First. What does it mean? But Asia has been doing Asia First for quite a while. Basically, since the collapse of the Soviet Union almost 30 years ago, Asian economies have been pursuing the resurrection of the ancient Silk Roads that go back 500, 1,000 years. Times at which they had more interactions, more trade, more commerce with each other than with the rest of the world. And Christian, just to be clear, that is already true today. As we already discussed, Asians trade more with each other than they do with the rest of the world. And that is going to accelerate because you have the energy trade from the Persian Gulf suppliers to the thirsty East Asian and South Asian markets. You have the growing volumes of infrastructure investment through China's Belt and Road Initiative. You have many of these new trade agreements like the RCEP. All of that, before the trade war, adds up and points in the direction of Asians wanting to internally integrate further. They have so many complementarities, whether it is the financially rich countries, the industrial centers, or the commodities producers. They still have a lot more complementarities to exploit. So I fully expect Asia First to continue no matter what American policy is.
And you actually also sort of posit a kind of reverse export syndrome. You say the world has gotten used to hearing America first, but it's ready for Asia first, as you just said. What happens when Asia no longer just produces for the West, but the West produces for Asia? And when Asians don't aspire to live like the West, but rather Western societies wish they had Asian stability and far-sighted leadership. Get ready to see the world and the future from the Asian point of view. Really?
Oh, absolutely. Now, let's break it down by the economic or commercial issues and the political and maybe cultural issues around pride and confidence. First of all, in terms of them no longer producing for us, but us producing for them, if you look at everything from luxury brands and cosmetics, the Hollywood studios, automobiles, high-tech goods, and electronics, sure, America is a huge market, in many cases the largest consumer market in the world for these categories and the top destination of sales. But ask yourself what the market capitalization would be of those companies were it not for the fact that they also have tremendous exports and sales in Asia. Just take the example of Apple. Look at what has happened to Apple's valuation as a result of the reports that it has declining revenue in China. And that's why it's rapidly shifted to say we're also going to manufacture, to assemble iPhones in India as well. So if American companies, Western companies, don't diversify their footprint around Asia and lose out to Asian competitors, they will, Christian, be smaller and smaller companies. There's no question about how important it is to sell into Asian markets today. They are the fastest growing middle class in the world.
Okay, but we're talking also that the corollary point to that was that you posit the notion that potentially Western societies, free, democratic, culturally diverse, politically, religiously, all the rest of it, might aspire to live like Asian societies and envy their stability and far-sighted leadership. That's a stretch.
If you look at the Trump and Brexit phenomenon today, and imagine yourself being a millennial or a young Asian person who's grown up since the 1990s or 2000s, it's not a stretch at all. It's the world that about 5 billion Asians live in which they really do feel that they have experienced a quantum leap in economic growth and modernization, and while maintaining political stability all this time. And the young Asians, Christian, many of whom you know and have met and I live among as I travel across the region, really feel what I just said and what you just quoted to be a perfectly natural sentiment. It's not about rejecting democracy. I want to be absolutely
No, but you're suggesting that Westerners might want to live like that. Not other Asians.
Well, there's two things. So there's a couple of facts that we need to remember. First of all, more Asians live in democratic societies than in the rest of the world put together. In just the next few months, India, Indonesia, the Philippines are having elections. There are 1.8 billion people just across those few countries. So Asians have plenty of experience with democracy. There are many Asian democratic systems. It is just like it's a mistake to conflate all of Asia with just China. It's a mistake to talk about Asia as if it is a monolithic monolithic set of authoritarian powers. It certainly isn't. It's the most culturally diffuse region of the world. Then there's the fact that they've learned a lot from the inheritance of European colonialism, parliamentary democratic systems, a strong civil service. They've also learned a lot from the American world of the 20th century, which is to say the love of freedom, democracy, entrepreneurialism. An Asian century is not one in which those ideas, those legacies that have made the West great and continue to define its greatness are being cast aside. It's about Asians actually taking some of those ideas and incorporating them and carrying them forward. And I think that's what we're starting to see. Now, Asians have maybe a deference for a strong executive with a long-term vision of national modernization. Some of the most popular leaders in the world today, Christian, as you know, based on public opinion surveys, are people like Prime Minister Modi or Duterte in the Philippines. We often talk about them and report about them for their very illiberal kinds of characteristics, and there's a lot to criticize about them. However, ask yourself why they have such strong support. It's because they're also trying to deliver a collective vision of national progress. Think about where they're coming from and where they have what they have achieved so far. And you can fairly well understand why many Asians today are confident in their systems and don't look to the West for lessons in how to improve themselves. They do look a lot to each other, though.
It's really fascinating, and the horizon you've just laid out is huge. The future is Asian. Parakhana, thank you so much indeed for joining us.